Go. All right. Hi. So today I have with me Ann Campbell, San Mateo County Superintendent. She was elected 2 times, and she has graciously agreed to answer some questions here about equity in education. So thank you, Ann. For those who don't know, could you give us a little background about the Tinsley Settlement and what your experience and your background as an administrator with the Tinsley Settlement was?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Kristen, for really delving into this important topic, because there's a lot that I think those of us on the peninsula need to learn about the racial disparities and the economic disparities that currently exist in our school districts. And by the work that you're doing, you're really bringing that to the fore. And I think certainly my hope would be that coming out of this, there would be increased awareness and the commitment on the part of people to really think about how do we make the system better for all of our kids, because it's not in a great place right now for all of our kids. So, well, and I'm sure we'll get into that as we get farther into this. But the Tinsley Settlement actually dates back to 1976, when a group of individuals from primarily the Ravenswood City School District, but some other areas in the peninsula as well, brought a lawsuit against a variety of school districts in the southern part of San Mateo County that said that students were not getting equal educational opportunity because of racial isolation that was going on with students who attended the Ravenswood City School District. And that lawsuit dragged on, quite frankly, for almost 10 years and was finally settled in, I think, 1986, where basically the Palo Alto Unified School District, the Ravenswood City School District, the Sequoia Union High School District, and all of the feeder districts to Sequoia agreed on a settlement. And there are, if anybody's interested, you can read the settlement. It's an interesting document, actually, but it called for a variety of measures to be taken to try to decrease that racial isolation. And one of the planks of the settlement was that it would there would be a voluntary transfer program where a certain number of kids every year, probably in the vicinity of 150, 155 or so, could leave the Ravenswood City School District to go into the Palo Alto Unified School District and then into the feeder districts in Sequoia. And they could apply as kindergartners, first graders, or second graders. If they eventually ended up as a member of the voluntary transfer program, they basically became considered a resident of the school district that they were to attend and had residency in terms of being able to be in that school district for the duration of their time. So if they were in Palo Alto, that meant that kids could go not just through the 8th grade, but all the way through high school, even though they live in the Sequoia Union High School District, because that's East Palo Alto is part of that school district for high school. Based on the size of each of the various school districts, a certain target level of voluntary transfer students was established. And then the San Mateo County Office of Education was put in charge of accepting applications, of having a fair process, and if there were more applications than there were slots, doing a lottery, so that students could be assigned hopefully to the school districts that they had requested, but there was some give and take with that over time. Interestingly enough, also as part of that settlement, the reverse could happen, where students could apply to transfer from, for example, the Palo Alto School District or San Carlos or wherever to attend school in Ravenswood to try to address the racial inequities that had happened. I'm not aware of that happening. If it has happened, it's only been a couple of kids over the life of the Tinsley program. And then the other one, part of that settlement also called for 2 other aspects. And one was that, or the San Mateo County Office of Education was in charge of actually accepting applications and assigning the students to districts and helping with that process. The Santa Clara County Office of Education was given the job of maintaining all of the data on student achievement, and just there's quite a historical set of data now actually that dates back to 1986 when this all started. So they had that responsibility. And then the other part of it that I learned about when I became principal at Ralston School in 1990, was that it established something called district interaction that was designed that you had the voluntary transfer program going on, and that was fine. But all of the kids in all of those feeder districts and Ravenswood were coming together in the Sequoia Union High School District when they were freshmen in high school. And many of them had not had any contact with each other, and yet they were going to be in the same schools as high school students. And so the interaction group really focused on with 8th graders, and then when kids got into the 9th grade, designing a variety of activities for them to participate in together to try to break down some of the barriers that existed between kids, to try to really make things more, that kids would get to know each other better. And then, boy, I think that stopped probably around 1997 or so, somewhere in that area. And I don't know why it stopped, but it was, I participated in some of those sessions. They were well done, and they did help kids to kind of get past some of the, I don't know about this, feelings that they were having. So as far as an administrator goes, I've had a variety of experiences with the Tinsley program, and they did start in 1990 when I became principal of Ralston Middle School in Belmont, because Belmont Redwood Shores was receiving students from the Ravenswood City School District. And I still remember the very first day of school that I was principal there, someone saying, "The Tinsley bus is here, the Tinsley bus is here, you need to go out and meet the Tinsley bus." And I thought, the Tinsley bus. And then I went out, and here was the bus that was bringing students from East Palo Alto for the 6th graders for their first day of middle school. And I felt badly for our voluntary transfer program students because of the unpredictability of busing. And they had a very long bus ride, but they also, because of traffic and just all kinds of different issues, the bus would be late. And then they would be late to the beginning of school, and they would have to walk into their first period classes. And it just, we worked very hard to try to minimize that. But I often thought it must be very hard for them to do that. And then when I was the superintendent, both in Belmont Redwood Shores and in Portola Valley, both of those school districts have Tinsley students in their student population. So it was more at a policy level at that point that I was dealing with the program. The superintendents of the districts who receive Tinsley students meet several times a year, so I would go to those meetings. And one thing I would say in thinking about that is, at one point, Redwood City was part of the Tinsley program. And then as the demographics in Redwood City changed very dramatically in the 1990s, they obviously had enough racial diversity within their school district that they petitioned the court and were able to leave the Tinsley program. So they don't receive voluntary transfer students anymore. I also think, and I really should check on this, I think Belmont Redwood Shores actually is at a point where it may have enough racial diversity that technically it would be able to withdraw from the Tinsley program. But I think there's a sense there that they would really like to continue to participate in it, just because it brings a level of economic diversity that they may not have within their school district as well. But then all the other districts are part of it. And I would say, from the superintendent meetings that I have attended over the years, both as a district level superintendent and then as the county superintendent, I think it goes back and forth about, do we want to try to leave? Do we want to go back to the court to petition to dissolve the Tinsley settlement? And the legal advice that the superintendents have always been given by county council is, if you go back to court, you realize that you open this all up again. And it really, if you look at kind of what's going on right now in the various school districts, it has not achieved the outcome that was expected to be achieved for the Ravenswood School District in particular. Do you really want to do that and open that situation up again? Because you don't know what a judge might decide to do. And part of the reason that the settlement was entered into was particularly for the Sequoia Union High School District and its feeder districts, a real concern that a judge might ultimately decide to make that a unified school district to really begin to address the inequities that are there from funding and performance and just a whole host of other issues. And so do they want to do that? so it's been kind of a moot point for the time being anyway.
Right. The issue of self-determination.
Yeah, people are very, very loyal to their elementary school district. It's really interesting to try to, when I was county superintendent, I worked not in the southern part of the county, but up in the northern part of the county to try to get two of the very tiny school districts to join together and to combine. And boy, when you start going after people's school districts, that allegiance to my local school district is very, very strong.
We have a lot of very small school districts in San Mateo County.
We do indeed. I mean, there are 23 school districts in San Mateo County.
Yeah, there certainly are. So yeah, so you've kind of gone over what the intent of Tinsley was. I mean, there were 3, I think, stated intents in the listed in the suit or in the settlement. And then what do you think the impact of the settlement has been over these decades?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it's hard to measure. I think the impact has been, we now have students in the Tinsley program who are 3rd generation. So their grandparents were Tinsley students, their parents were, and now the current students are. So I have to think that from an impact perspective, from families who have participated in it, and they obviously have felt it's had a positive impact on their lives and want that impact for their children's lives. I think from an academic performance perspective, and I haven't looked at the most recent data, but I know while I was at the County Office of Education and in Portola Valley also, the students who were from East Palo Alto and East Menlo Park who were part of the Tinsley program, when you looked at how they were performing academically, were not performing necessarily at the level of the resident students in the school districts where they were attending, but they were outperforming their peers in Ravenswood. So what that means, I'm honestly not sure, but I think it does mean academically that for whatever reason, they were doing better than they might have done had they been in Ravenswood. From an impact perspective, from a student's point of view, I've always wondered about how if I were a student in East Palo Alto who was riding a bus at least an hour a day to go from East Palo Alto to Portola Valley, for example, what's my experience like? I have to get up very, very early in the morning. I take that long bus ride. I'm at school for the whole day, and then I get on the bus at the end of the day, and the process repeats itself in reverse. It became very hard for students, both in Belmont and in Portola Valley, and I assume in the other districts as well, to participate in a lot of after-school activities, because if they did, then they couldn't necessarily get back to East Palo Alto. And I know in those districts, they worked on trying to have a later bus for students so that they could participate in that. The other impact I think from it is, I think about it from a parent's perspective. And again, just if I think about Portola Valley or Belmont for that matter, they're both geographically quite far removed from East Palo Alto. If I'm a parent and there's back to school night and there are a variety of other activities going on, PTA, whatever it may be, do I really get into my car at the end of the day and drive all the way there to participate in that? Do I feel like I'm really a part of the school district? So I've often wondered about that as well. I know in Portola Valley, we actually started to go down to East Palo Alto to do a variety of parent activities just to try to make some more connections with our staff and with the parents and the families too, the kids. I mean, we would do various activities as well. But I also think the impact on Ravenswood has been pretty profound, because if you think of 150 students every year becoming part of the Tinsley program, that's a lot of kids to be losing. And the irony is many of the districts that receive Tinsley students are basic aid school districts. And Ravenswood is not. It gets revenue based on its per student attendance. So those kids are leaving. Certainly the district isn't having to educate them, but they're not getting those funds to help fund their school district either. So I think there's some real financial implications that have probably were unintended, honestly, but that's what's happened.
Yeah, yeah. Has your opinion of the Tinsley settlement changed over time?
No, my opinion of the Tinsley settlement hasn't really changed. I think the intent of it was, I think it was well intended in terms of trying to make an impact on trying to erase the racial disparities and the opportunity disparities that existed then. And just because of what's happened in the way that the peninsula economy has grown in the time since 1986, I think that the disparities between school districts is much more glaring than it was then. And I don't know that that's a Tinsley issue as much as it is a basic school funding equity issue. And I think when the Tinsley settlement came to pass, it was really focused on giving kids the opportunity to have a different kind of an educational experience. And I think for those kids, for the most part, that's been a positive experience for them. I think we're now in a very, very different era where the inequities between school districts and school funding is incredibly dramatic. And while the local control funding formula that Governor Brown put into effect with the legislature 5 or 6 years ago now is trying to address that by getting funding to kids who don't have the same opportunities that other kids have, who are perhaps living in poverty or learning English as a second language or in foster care. For whatever reason, that hasn't erased those inequities that exist. And so I think we have to really look and see how they're getting what they need. And when people talk about equity, that's what they mean. What kind of support and scaffolding do you have in place to make sure that every child who's in our public school system has got a good shot at being successful at whatever it is they ultimately want to do? And we're a long ways away from being there, in my opinion.
Yes, I agree. How long did you think that Tinsley settlement might be in effect? I mean,
I never really thought about that. That's an interesting question. I just assumed it was effective life and that was that.
Yeah.
And when I looked at it through a principal's lens, I mean, we received students and we were to educate them, and that's the way it was. We did.
Right.
And when I looked at it from a policy perspective as a superintendent, I never really questioned its existence particularly, although I know from being in a variety of meetings, there were some of my colleagues who really did question it and wanted it to disband. I never really thought much about that.
Yeah. Do you have an idea what you think equity could look like now?
Oh boy. Well, I'll just use some of my experiences as an example. If you're a student in the Portola Valley School District, you're living in a basic aid school district, which means that your property taxes exceed the amount that the state says you should have per student. So you get to keep those property taxes to go towards the education of students in that school district. So those students have a higher per pupil expenditure just going into the mix. They have a parcel tax, they have a foundation that also produces income for the school district. So in that district, students who attend school there have small class sizes. They have art, physical education, music specialists. They have a full-time librarian. They have a whole bunch of different supports in place. The technology that they have at school is always cutting edge, and it's, you know, just the most modern that it can be. They go to school in very nice facilities that have been funded by bonds. So they're probably spending, when all is said and done, somewhere in the range of $24,000–$25,000 per student. And then if you look at a school district, for example, like Redwood City, where I happen to live, or the Ravenswood City School District, even with the local control funding formula, which is giving them extra dollars for students who need more assistance, they're not able to get to that level. And so the question is, well, what does it take to be sure that our kids are all getting similar opportunities in their education? Why shouldn't every kid, and I'm not knocking Portola Valley at all, because I think that's exactly what an education should be for kids. But then why shouldn't a student in Redwood City or East Palo Alto or East Menlo Park have the same opportunities at their school to have that kind of support system in place and to have those opportunities? And I think what we have to say is, in California, where we're the 5th or 6th largest economy, depending on who's talking about it in the world, and we have such tremendous levels of wealth, we need to be investing in our kids because they're our future. And if we expect to continue to thrive the way our state has thrived, we've got to really be looking at who our students are who are in our public schools, and what do we need to do to get them to be as successful as possible. And that requires a lot more funding, I think. And it means reducing that opportunity gap, for want of a better word.
Opportunity gap is a good term, actually. I mean, there's plenty of research and data out there that shows student achievement is connected to things like art and music and access to books and libraries. And we can put a number on how much that costs. It's not too hard. So how can we get there? Do you have any ideas for how we could get the funding? You mentioned we are a pretty big economy. I'm not a funding genius.
We are a pretty big economy. And if you and I had been having this conversation a year ago, you know, I was working with Debbie Martin on something that we were calling Every Kid, Every School, that really was an approach to say, we need to really put a great deal of pressure on the legislature to say, we need to re-examine how we're funding, what our funding priorities are in California, and we need to be making our kids our top priority. And so the amount of money that's going into the prison system, or that's going here, or that's going there, shouldn't we be perhaps investing in keeping that type of a system from having to be in existence in the first place? Wouldn't we be better off to give our kids the kind of education that they need so that they can go out into the economy and be taxpayers and have good jobs and, you know, live lives that are fulfilling lives, rather than getting to put in this pipeline to prison that a lot of is happening for a lot of our kids. So I think as a society, we need to really re-examine our priorities and say, what is it that's important to us? And if this is important, then we have to invest in it, and we've got to make it a priority. And I think part of that is most people are very unaware of the funding inequities that exist. You know, you and I happen to be aware of them because we're educators and we see it every day. But the average person, that's not necessarily on their radar screen. And I don't think I think if people became more aware of kind of what the reality is, that they would say, wait a minute, this is not okay. We need to do something about it. You know, today where we are with COVID and the impact, and here we all are, it's very hard to know how to go about addressing this, but just given everything that's happened in our country in the last 2 months, obviously people's awareness levels are going up about the disparities that exist and the systemic pressures that are there that are causing some of this to happen. So I guess I'm hopeful that the energy that's there may be able to help with this.
Me too. And as you just pointed out, the return on the investment in a child, rather than in prisons, is much greater if you can put $1 into the education of a child, more than into.
Yeah, I think it's costing something like $65,000, $70,000 for a prisoner to be in a state prison for a year. And if you think about what school districts are spending per student, I use the Portola Valley example. Well, that's $25,000 a year. That's a big difference. So,
It is.
and not that we don't need to be taking care of people who are in prison too, but it's kind of, there's a big disparity there about where our priorities are.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Wow, well, this has been really helpful, Anne, and hopeful actually for me. So thank you for taking the time. Did you have something else you wanted to add? I didn't ask you about any specific.
I've got 2 anecdotes just to share with you about the Tinsley program, and I don't know what
I did kind of skip over that because you talked so specifically about the settlement. But yes, I would like to hear some anecdotes.
There's 2 personal anecdotes, and one really is personal as a mom.
Yeah.
My kids went to Juana Briones Elementary School, and my son Doug, when he was in the 1st grade, became friends with a young student from East Palo Alto, and they were friends all the way through high school, and they played on the same football team at Gunn and remained really good friends. And I have always thought that that was an experience that Doug would not have had if it wasn't for the Tinsley program. And that's looking at it through my lens as a person of privilege. I'm glad that my child has had that experience. And I also think it was a good experience for the individual involved who is coming from the Tinsley program as well. But the other one is, and I've always wondered about this, when I was in Portola Valley, there's a wonderful school foundation, and every year they raise a great deal of money for the schools. And one day I was at the district office, and it was about 5 o'clock in the evening, and one of the parents of one of our Tinsley students came into the district office, and I welcomed her and said hello. And she had an envelope, and it had cash in it. And she said, "I want to give this to you." And I said, "Oh," and she said, "This is for the foundation. I want to give this money to the foundation. Last weekend, I sold tamales in East Palo Alto to my friends and my family, and this is the money from the tamale sale. And I just so appreciate the education that my student is receiving here. I wanted to participate in the fundraising drive that was going on." And I was just so touched by that, because she had driven all the way up from East Palo Alto. She'd spent the weekend doing that fundraising. And when you ask about impact, on the very human level, that's not a data level, but that's a human response. So obviously the impact there was great. So that would be my story to end with.
Love that. And it's the human connections that we make in schools that matter to us. And
yes,
that's what that is. I mean, that's why we fight so hard for our small school districts, because ultimately, when it comes down to it, what matters is the people that we get to know and love at our school. And that's who we're going to fight for, and who we end up loving and learning from in the end.
Very well said.
Well, you spent your life in schools, and you mattered to me when I was in school. So thank you for that, and thank you for still being here and still mattering.
Good. Well, thank you for doing the work you're doing, Kristen. It's really important.
Well, we've got a lot of work to do. I'm glad you're still here doing it with me. Thanks, Anne. All right, thanks for spending the time today, Anne.
Take good care, and happy new school year.
Yeah, you too. It's a doozy.
I think so. Take care.
Take care, Ann. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.